there's an epidemic of retail crime or even a tsunami of shop theft that's been impacting the high street in the UK. There's a problem with organised criminal networks that are targeting the retail sector. And sadly, they've seen that they can make huge amounts of money in the UK retail sector. There seems to be very little consequences.
Shoplifting is out of control. Well, that's what some large British retailers are saying, and the latest numbers do show a surge in the thefts. What's behind the trend? How much is organized and how much is opportunistic? And what does it mean for retailers? Well, Emmeline Taylor is a professor of criminology in London, and she's consulted for British Supermarket Co-op. Emmeline, welcome. And first of all, what is behind this continued rise in shoplifting that we're seeing?
Hi, Stephen. It's great to join you today. There's a whole range of factors that underpin the escalation of retail crime in the UK. There's really been a perfect storm post-pandemic. So some of those factors include a cost of living crisis, the rise in inflation, and also this has corresponded with a decline in resources for the police. It seems that some offenders now argue that they can commit these offences with relative impunity. There seems to be very little consequences.
We see that the number of cases have risen dramatically since the end of the pandemic. I would assume that the value of the goods stolen has also risen accordingly, the total value for these retailers. What does it mean for them in terms of their losses?
So it's been estimated by one industry body that this is costing the retail sector in excess of £2.2 billion every single year, just as a direct result of theft. When you then add in the correlating costs of crime prevention and crime controls or security initiatives, this easily surpasses £3 billion a year. So it's certainly making a huge impact on the profitability of businesses, but also their ability to operate safely. So let's just think about the numbers and this increase of what I've described as an epidemic of retail crime or even a tsunami of shop theft that's been impacting the high street in the UK. The last financial year saw a huge increase, and we've seen this year on year since the pandemic. So for the first time, police recorded incidents of shop theft surpassed 500,000 incidents. So that's the ones that have actually reported and come to the attention of the police. However, the industry say that's a drop in the ocean compared to the number of offences that they're actually experiencing. Through my own research, I suggest that less than 3% of incidents are actually reported and come to the attention of the police. And when you can imagine just 3% are being reported, you can probably guess that they're the most volatile, the most violent, or the most high value incidents. But yet less than half of those are actually then responded to by the police in person. Again, offenders are saying that they're given free rein to be able to continue to commit these offences. Now, I think that's about to change. We've got some significant changes in law that are coming down the line. But the scenario, the situation has really got out of control in recent years.
As you mentioned, there's a cost of living crisis that we've seen since the pandemic. Prices have gone up, not just in the UK, but elsewhere as well. Some might look at this and say, hey, retailers have made a lot of money during this time too. They've raised prices. People are just stealing to basically make ends meet. What can you say to that? Who is stealing right now?
It's a great question, because I think that is the sort of simplistic presumption that the vast majority of offences are committed by individuals who are struggling to make the household budget stretch as far as it needs to, and they're stealing for subsistence to put food on the table. Those individuals are not the ones that are keeping retailers awake at night. There's certainly a cohort of offenders, of course, but they'll be stealing in small amounts, low value items. The real issue here is that there's a problem with organised criminal networks that are targeting the retail sector because they see it as low risk and high reward. So these are polycriminals, meaning that they would engage in other activities should they wish to turn their hand to drug dealing or trafficking or weapons provision. They're looking for those opportunities. And sadly, they've seen that they can make huge amounts of money in the UK retail sector. So I think that's where we need to focus much of our attention. But there are other categories of offenders or offender profiles. Another large proportion are those that are sadly drug affected, and they're stealing in bulk to be able to then fund their drug habits, lining the pockets of those drug dealers and other unsavory individuals in society. It's been estimated that maybe as high as 70% of shop thefts are committed by somebody who is funding an established and entrenched drug addiction. But there's a new and emerging, I would say, category of offender. And these individuals I term the criminal entrepreneurs or the shoplifting entrepreneurs. And these are people who you might not imagine would be thieves. They might look quite well respectable, but they found a niche market. One example might be the theft of toys. We've seen a real issue with that in recent years. So whether it's Lego, whether it's Jellycats, plush toys, there's been a huge drive for the theft of these items. So these criminal entrepreneurs will steal in bulk. They'll take the advantage of the fact they don't look like a stereotypical offender, and then they will sell these items online using community e-commerce peer-to-peer platforms such as Vinted or eBay or Facebook community platforms, where they can sell on with very little verification of their identity. So they take advantage of the fact that they can sell on in bulk with relative anonymity. So there's lots of different profiles of offenders. It's certainly not just the cost of living crisis that is driving this.
I want to touch on some of those distinctions in just a moment, but given that all of these, one could argue, lead ultimately back to the rising cost of living, could it be that this is a kind of temporary phenomenon that comes with this kind of swell in prices, and it could slowly pass as there are kind of adjustments, inflation falls, et cetera?
I don't think this crime type will naturally just pass. I think there has to be some interventions, and that has to be a collaboration between the industry, the security sector, police, law enforcement, and government as well. So in the UK, there's two pieces of legislation that we will be seeing coming to be enacted soon. Now, one is actually repealing a piece of legislation that was brought in 2014, and that deemed that offences up to the value of £200 would be considered low-level theft, so almost a petty crime. And it signalled to offenders that they could steal up to the value of £200 and expect very little consequence. Now, that arbitrary threshold is going to be removed soon. And then, so any value of theft, a crime is a crime. And I think we'll begin to see more police attention for those lesser value items, because many prolific offenders would just keep stealing up to that amount. So that was a real issue. The second piece of legislation, which I think will make a big difference, is that it will become a standalone offence to assault a shop worker. So somebody who is simply serving their community and they're assaulted either by getting in the way of a shoplifter who's trying to leave the premises with stolen goods, or maybe there's an altercation with an individual who might be intoxicated or suffering some sort of irritation in the store. So again, I think this will send a real strong message to offenders and to victims that this will be taken seriously. So I certainly don't think we can just look at inflation and just hope that as the economic forecast improves, that shoplifting will simply become a thing of the past. That's certainly not the case.
Just to be clear, have we seen a kind of statistical rise in assault against retail workers? And would they not have already been covered under current assault laws?
So sadly, there has been a big increase post-pandemic, and there's a range of factors that underscore this. I think we've seen rising levels of aggression, anxiety, and sadly, this plays out in the retail space quite often because individuals are coming face to face with somebody who's working in a store who might hold some decision making over them, or they simply bear the brunt of their frustrations. One industry body estimated that there's now over 2,000 violent or aggressive incidents every single day that shop workers face. That situation has become out of control. Now, to go back to your point around the legislation on assaults, now, of course, that is already illegal to assault somebody in any walk of life, whether they're serving you goods in a store or whether simply just walking down the street. The issue that there was is that it was almost impossible to estimate the true figure of assaults because there's no requirement within the way the incidents are recorded by the police to locate it within a store. I think this will provide shop workers with the support that they need to recognize this isn't just part of the job. They shouldn't have to absorb this aggression. They shouldn't have to take the kicks and punches just because they're in that particular role. So I think we'll begin to see that hopefully this will support the industry to really protect those hardworking shop workers.
I want to go back to your sort of diversification of the kinds of shoplifting that retailers are seeing. You mentioned crime rings, essentially, organized crime rings that are, in many cases, support this kind of shoplifting. We've heard about this from other places as well, the US, Europe. Give us the distinctions of these kind of crime rings. What do they look like? Where are they coming from? Is there similarity with other crime rings elsewhere? Or is it spontaneous?
Yeah, I mean, they can look quite different, but some of the key sort of features of these organized criminal retail networks is that there's multiple people. These aren't solo enterprises. There'll be multiple people with defined roles within the network. So whether that's somebody who's stealing, somebody who's liaising with fences, somebody who's looking to establish new markets, the drivers of the people who'll be going out and stealing. Now, unfortunately, these networks, they will often take advantage of vulnerable adults and children to steal on their behalf and see them as relatively disposable collateral should they then come to the attention of law enforcement. Some of these groups travel internationally, so they may be coming from mainland Europe and into the UK for a day or several days to steal as much as they can and then take the goods elsewhere. They're very organized and very aware of logistics and supply chains and what the hot products are that will obtain the highest values. Now, we've got a great initiative in the UK that was launched just over a year ago called it was dubbed Operation Pegasus. It's actually part of a police crime unit called OPAL, the Serious Organised Acquisitive Crime Unit, a national police organisation. Now, they've introduced a retail strand now to their intelligence gathering, and they've managed to map tens of groups that are operating in this way and begin to look at the profile of these individuals that are working together. And they're finding that typically they would be engaged in other types of illegal activity, so not just retail crime. But it's really important. This is a great example of how the industry can work together hand in hand with law enforcement for a shared good. And I think that's what's been a real step change in recent years, because it wasn't so long ago that retailers would point the finger at the police would point the finger at the industry and say, you're not doing enough. But now they've come together to work together and really getting some fantastic traction to tackle these organized networks.
We know that other media have been reporting on the shoplifting trend as well, and we found actually some of the user reactions to some of these pieces quite interesting. For example, here's one comment under a recent BBC video. It says, Tesco operating profit for 24-25 was £3.1 billion. That's up 10.9% from the year before. An increase of £341 million profit in 1 year. The point being that retailers have done well in recent years as consumers have paid more. What do you say to this? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but are retailers complaining inordinately about a marginal loss of stock? What do you say to that?
If I were to get, a bonus through work or, luckily receive an increase in wages, I certainly wouldn't expect people to then see that as a green light to begin stealing from me. But I certainly take the point that there's often an ideological component to some of the excuses that people use when they do deliberately defraud or steal from a company. We've seen this a lot recently in the USA, and people stealing from businesses that they feel are not operating ethically or in the way that they should do. As long ago as 1957, there were two criminologists that wrote a paper, and this paper was called Techniques of Neutralization. It's Gresham Sykes and David Matzer, if any of the watchers want to look this up. Now, they identified 5 key techniques of neutralization that offenders use. And these are essentially justifications, they're excuses that otherwise law-abiding citizens use to excuse their immoral or illegal behaviour. And one of them is to deny injury. And so that's to say, this isn't really harming anybody, there's no victims here. This is a victimless crime. Or you condemn the condemners is another one of theirs. So basically, as you say, pointing to the profits of these businesses and saying, they can absorb this. They're the real criminals. They're not paying the farmers enough, or, they're passing on these inflated prices to the consumers. Now, I would push back on that because I think often it is far more complicated than just suggesting that profits should then be distributed. And there's a key point here. It's not just the big businesses that are being targeted. We're seeing a rise in criminal offences, whether it's theft, violence, antisocial behaviour, against independent stores, against convenience stores that certainly aren't posting these levels of profits. So I think what we've introduced in recent years in the UK is this climate of criminality and this climate of aggression. And the more people try to excuse it through these ideological lenses, you're given a green light to other criminals who are not motivated by that ideology, but just through sheer greed. So it's a very complicated area, but I think criminologists over the years will often point to the fact that every criminal has a whole raft of excuses ready to trip off the tongue.
And I realize this is getting a bit more into the business aspect of it. You're a criminal professor, but why can't retailers simply absorb the pain? A lot of our viewers will look at this and say, big profits. How can you explain where those profit margins go? And will insurers cover the cost? That's another comment that we see a lot. Insurers will just make up for whatever's stolen.
Yes, again, I think that is a common misnomer around the level that insurance will foot the bill for retail crime and customer theft. As to the decisions whether they should pass on the profits, grocery in particular operates on tiny margins. And so stealing just a handful of items is always going to hurt their profits. That's a question, I think, for businesses, how they choose to distribute it. But I certainly don't think anybody wants to live in a society where people just walk into stores and help themselves while other law-abiding citizens are paying the price for them doing so.
Here's another comment that we found interesting, and this was from another piece that we saw, I think, in the British press. The writer, and we don't know how much of this is true, but this is what he writes. I earn £70,000 per annum, and my girlfriend earns £50,000. We don't have kids and steal constantly from big supermarkets. All of these companies are making record profits despite not giving pay rises to their staff, reducing the size and quality of food, and increasing prices. We need to stand up for ourselves against this corrupt government and greedy companies. I just want to ask that since the pandemic, do you think this is a more mainstream view or a view that you're detecting more? Or is this kind of an online sort of exception? How do you look at it?
I think there's certainly been a politicisation of acquisitive crime. So I think people are trying to inject some sort of anarchy or some sort of resistance mentality and using that to excuse theft. I don't feel that argument holds much weight. And I think part of the issue, going back before to the overwhelming view that this is people who are trying to put food on the table that are stealing, I think it's really unfortunate that they're almost being scapegoated. And so we begin to criminalise poverty when actually it's people who could well afford to pay the full ticket price for their goods that are actually the ones that are helping themselves. So I think there's a smoke and mirrors would be the phrase here in the UK as to who the real culprits are and those who are perhaps jumping on the bandwagon and taking advantage of the economic circumstances of those who are below the poverty line. So again, I think it's about challenging some of those excuses, those ideologies, and the normalization of shop theft. And I think pointing out the fact that shop theft so often goes hand in hand with violence, with aggression. Is that really the climate that we want to have on our high streets and in our stores? I'd suggest not. It's one of the biggest employers in the UK. It's the biggest private sector employer. So we all have relatives, friends, aunties, sisters who work in this sector. And one of the things that I'm hearing from these hardworking shop workers is not necessarily the direct violence, but the cumulative mental damage that is caused from living, from working day in, day out in these hostile environments where people feel entitled enough to just go in, clear the shelves without any intention of paying for their goods and then leaving the store. That's having a real harmful effect, not on the business, of course, it's impacting their profits, but it's having a real impact on those shop workers who live in our communities. So I suggest questioning ourselves on that aspect of it is really important.
You've talked about some of the solutions to this, including on the judicial side and how these crimes are classified and considered in terms of punishing or sentencing as well. You will likely get some blowback as well from certain groups who say that you're going to capture some of the low-level offenders along with these bigger crime groups as well. Given how diverse these groups of shoplifters are, is there a concern that maybe an overreaction to this will then catch up a lot of people who may be in worse circumstances?
Criminal justice always has to be proportionate, and for the crime unit that I mentioned that is targeting organised retail crime networks, that these individuals are exploiting vulnerable adults, they're exploiting children, they're involved in drugs, weapons, human trafficking, etc. I think nobody could disagree that these individuals really do need to feel the full weight of the law. But there's a threshold of severity for those individuals, and those that might be involved in low-level petty crime. As I mentioned earlier, these are not the individuals that are keeping retailers awake at night or keeping the police busy. It has to be proportionate in terms of the punishment that they receive. But again, this isn't about giving a green light to individuals who might be stealing to put food on the table. I would hope that most retailers, and it's certainly the case in the UK, I'm not sure what the scenario is in Germany, but there has to be alternative means for those individuals to seek support. And we're seeing some great initiatives where individuals who might be stealing for subsistence or through homelessness and poverty are being signposted to ways in which they can then access the services or the goods that they require. So it's not using a sledgehammer to, crack a nut. That's certainly not the case. I think we need a more sophisticated approach that targets the intervention to the profile of the offender. And I think that's the point that we're beginning to reach now.
All right, that's Emmeline Taylor. She's professor of criminology at City St. George's University of London. Emmeline, thank you so much.
Thank you.